Okay, and this is our last session for today. Again, what's the best story? Loud. Ones that people read and the one that you're interested in. Okay, so again, just to recap some of the things we want to do as interviewers, never ever be impolite, ever. It's like burning your bridges. You, as a journalist, you have the power, and you'll be tagged as an abusive person if you ever get impatient. So if people get angry over your story, say yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, especially if you're in Texas, and yes, sir, and no, sir, and it won't hurt you. It'll protect the three things we want to protect in our news at GNI or any newspaper we worked at is the credibility, the observation, and the not the liability, but the someone help me out. What's the objectivity, credibility, legitimacy. Thank you. So that's the senior moment right there. Okay, so mentioned something off camera that Deborah wanted me to mention was that in video, when you're doing video, when you mention people's names, when you write for video, you say their names first, and then you say what their quote is. In print, you say their name last. The reason is because in print, when you're reading the quote and you see their name, you can go back to the quote and go over it again. But in audio, it just goes by. So if you have a long quote, the listener is wondering who in the world said this. When you finally say it, they forget what they said. And you don't want that because the good story is the one that people are listening to. Okay, earlier I said today, don't underestimate the purpose for what God has you sitting in your chair. And I wanted you to look at this story called Bitterness Between Mohawk Nation and French Canadians Reconciled. This was a story I did last year for Resonate News, and I think I mentioned I'm the editor of Resonate News right now at www.resonatenews.com. And you can look at this story yourself and read it. But just to capsulize it, when you do your stories, you GNI reporters all over the world, you may be the only person who's ever told this story. Now, I think that's what GNI hopes is going to happen, that you're going to be covering stories that nobody else is going to do. So you want to handle it with care, you want to handle it with accuracy, you want to handle it with diplomacy, so you can be credible, you can be legitimate, and you can be a good observer. Okay, in this particular story, I want to explain to you about this questions, about keep asking questions. Remember that? I was telling you about that. Francine LeMay is a French Canadian whose brother was killed in the Oka crisis of 1999. Now, if you're not a Canadian, you probably don't know that the Oka crisis is when the Mohawk Nation blocked off the freeway from Montreal for 76 days. Can you imagine going out to your local highway and blocking it for 76 days? And the reason they blocked it was because the people in Montreal wanted to build a golf course on their ancestral burial grounds. And the Mohawks said, we don't think so. So they blocked off the freeway. There was some contention there. Finally, the Montreal police got out there, and a single shot was fired. It went under the armor of one of the policemen, Francine LeMay's brother, Marcel, and he was killed. And after that, the army came in and cleared them away, and the crisis was over. But Canadians, most Canadians know about the Oka crisis. They'll remember it the same way Americans will remember where they were when Kennedy was shot. And so this woman who's decided to ask, after 20 years, the Mohawk Nation to forgive her. Not that she forgave them for the killing of her brother, but that she asked the Mohawk tribe to forgive French Canadians for the abuses that they had perpetrated on the Mohawk Nation for 200 years. So that's interesting. She's also a translator, so she translates things from English to French. Yes, and so what she did was took a history of the Mohawk people that was in English and translated it to French. And on the Oka Crisis anniversary, on the 20th anniversary, she presented the tribe with the translation. It's called Out of the Woods. Now, let me ask you, if you heard this story, the elements I just told you, what's the story? Where's the story? What do you hear? Forgiveness. Well, that's the first thing I thought of too. But guess what the French media covered and the national Canadian media covered? What did they cover? The translation of the book. This wonderful woman whose brother was killed translated this book of Mohawk history into French. How wonderful. That's where they left the story. So this over-interviewed woman, and I was the very last person to interview her. Matter of fact, she refused my interview because I was, the Indian fellow that you see on the screen there, called me when I was at Walmart shopping and said, "Are you interested in talking to this woman about the Oka crisis?" And I didn't know what it was. So he said, "No, this is a big deal. We're going to go there for reconciliation." So when I called her, she said, "No, I'm tired. I can't talk." And I said, "I promise I'll be brief." I was desperate. I promise. Now, someone asked me earlier during the break, what happens when someone you're talking to doesn't want to be interviewed? Well, you know, you try to get them to interview. You get the interview anyway. Be as sensitive as you can and say, "What can I do to help you? What can I do to serve you? Or do you have a problem? Can I read you the story later over the phone?" Don't ever show people your entire story. Read it to them over the phone, or you'll lose your legitimacy in your observation platform. But bend over backwards to help them any way you can. And I said, "I'll be brief. It'll be short. Please consider me." So she considered it and called me back later and said, "Okay, I'll give you an interview." During the interview, she told me that she forgave the Mohawks. So what's the question you would ask her? Why? Why? What's your motivation to forgive the Mohawks? They killed your brother. And she told me, because somebody has to go first. You know, when bitterness is there and people are intractable and you have 200 years of the Mohawks hating the French Canadians and the French Canadians hating the Mohawks, somebody has to go first. So the title of the story was Going First. Bitterness between Mohawk Nation and French Canadians reconciled. So I went to this whole thing and I said, "Well, what made you want to forgive?" And she said to me, "Do you want to hear my testimony?" I said, "Sure, give me your testimony." So I had 45 minutes of her testimony. I typed it out. And then Rod asked a question about what do you do when you're going into sensitive areas and people are concerned about this. I transcribed, I took the best parts of her interview out, and I wrote the story in a day, because I told you I could write pretty fast after 4 or 5 years of doing this. I pumped out this story and called her back on the phone and read her the entire story, because she said, "If my parents see this, they'll be very upset because they don't understand why I became a Christian, why I left." She joined a Native American Mohawk church, and she married a Native guy, and they can't understand why she did that, and she didn't want them to feel blamed in her story. So I read her the entire story, which I don't usually do, but there are times, I promised her I would read her the story. She was in tears at the end of the story. She said, "I don't know how you did this. I don't know." And what a payoff for, you know, being a writer. You know, if you ever want affirmation, get something like that happening. Someone is in tears. She goes, "Thank you so much for writing the story. No one has done this for me." Now, you GNI writers, listen. You're going to be in situations where you're going to be the only person who will ever tell their story. Handle it with care. Let them tell the story. Read it back to them if you need to, so they'll be protected. And here's the question I asked her. I said, you've been interviewed by CBN, Canadian Broadcasting Network. You've been featured in magazines, newspapers. How many reporters, and I just asked this for my own information, how many reporters have asked you the questions that I've asked? Because I wanted to see how redundant I was. And that means, redundant means how repetitive I was. And she said, "Nobody's asked me these questions." I'm at the end of a long line of journalists. So I said, and I'm working for resonatenews.com. Ever heard of it? So I said, let me get this straight. One guy in Texas is the only journalist in the world who's asked you your motivation to forgive the Mohawks. And she said, "That's right." Now I invite you to go to that story and read why she had the motivation to do it. It's a dynamic story. And it's buried on our website. I'd like it to go. As a matter of fact, if you'd forward it on your Facebook, I'd be really appreciative, because we all need to learn reconciliation. Man, isn't that the one of the keys to our problems in the world today? We need to learn how to reconcile. And what Francine said, she calls herself an artisan of peace, was very valuable. Okay, That's all I really have to say on this section. Do you guys have any questions that I can ask? I mean, that you need to ask me. Okay, Rod brought up something interesting. He was asking about fact checks. A journalist always said, when you write something, and you can do this in video easily by just having your transitional sentences, let them say what the point's going to be. Okay? In print, if you're going to quote someone or you're going to consolidate a quote, you say, they said, or she said, or he said. It's been tough going, he said. Or the work has really suffered during the economy, he said. Or event organizers estimated there were 500 people in the room. Don't count them yourself. It's sticking yourself in the story. If you go to a place and you need to say there were 1,000 people there, get someone to say, an event organizer said there were 1,000. That keeps you, as much as possible, attribute everything to somebody else to keep you out of the liability and out of the errors. Now, Rod brought up a great catch-22 here. What if you're in a culture that doesn't understand what lying is, and when they're telling you the facts, you don't know if they're really the facts? And you can't verify with them because they'll say, yes, that's right, but it's not. Now, as journalists, we want to protect those three things: our legitimacy, our credibility, and our observation platform. But if someone who's telling us there were 300 people in the room, but there were like 8, how do we get around it? What do we do? Have any ideas? What would you say? I just actually gave you the answer a few minutes ago. Okay. Now, you people that are watching on video, we've had some great discussions in between our sessions, and I'm hoping you're having these same kind of discussions to sharpen your skills and wrestling with some of these, how do we approach this? This is how you'll get to be good. The answer is, they said, he said. There were 300 people in the room, they said. Or so-and-so said. Now, if it comes out later that it was a lie, Rod didn't say it, this guy said it. Now, you have a choice. Do you want to embarrass the people, potentially embarrass the people, or do you just want to leave it out? And the journalist rule is, in general, when in doubt, leave it out. Okay, Duke Ellington also said, learn everything you can and forget it. So what am I saying about this? Is like, this approach to this writing is intuitive. It's, you play it by ear. You have some basic rules. You have your 21-word rule. You break it if you have to. The 21-word rule is that your lead is not over 21 words because people won't listen. Okay? And you find out what works. In general, you want to make it fast. You want to grab it. You want to be accurate. You want to be factual. You want to gain your credibility. You never want to put your reputation on the line or GNI on the line by something that could possibly be inaccurate or infactual. Give this the long view. Keep practicing. You're going to be good at it. Great. Bless you guys. It's really wonderful talking to you.